There is a very curious moment in the awakening journey, a quiet moment, almost imperceptible. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic spiritual event. It doesn't come with fireworks of realization. It doesn't appear as a life-changing revelation. In fact, it often happens so subtly that many people don't even notice when it begins. But when this moment arrives, something deeply important starts shifting inside you. And the change doesn't begin in your external life. It begins in the way you are present within it. Maybe you have already felt this. Maybe it happened during a completely ordinary moment, while walking somewhere, while looking at the sky, while drinking coffee in silence, or even during a day that seemed completely normal, and suddenly, something changes. For a few seconds, the mind becomes quiet, not because you tried to silence it, not because you applied some technique, but simply because, in that moment, you are no longer lost inside thought. And when that happens, something very interesting begins to occur. The world appears different. Colors seem slightly more vivid. Sounds feel clearer. Even time appears to slow down, but nothing outside has actually changed. What changed was something much deeper. Your attention returned to the present moment. And when this happens, a quiet question begins to arise inside many people. Is this presence? Most people believe presence is something that must be created, something that must be practiced, something that requires effort. But the truth is almost the opposite. Presence is not something you create. Presence is what remains when you stop being lost in the mind for a moment. And perhaps the most curious thing is that many people have already experienced moments like this, even before their spiritual journey began. Moments where you were simply there, not thinking, not analyzing, not trying to control anything. Maybe looking at the ocean, maybe listening to music, maybe watching someone you love. And for a few seconds, everything felt complete. Nothing needed to be solved. Nothing needed to be changed. Nothing needed to be understood. But then the mind returns. It always returns. And when it returns, it brings a familiar narrative. It says, that was just a moment. That doesn't mean anything. Go back to your thoughts. And so most people spend their entire lives moving in and out of these moments of presence, without realizing what is actually happening. But after a certain point in the awakening journey, these moments begin to appear more frequently, and something interesting starts happening. You begin to notice the difference between being lost in thought and simply being here. At first, that difference seems very small, but it changes everything. Because when you are lost in thought, your experience of life is built almost entirely by the mind. Thoughts about the past, thoughts about the future, thoughts about what should be happening, thoughts about what might go wrong, thoughts about who you think you are. But when you are present, something completely different happens. You begin to see that life is not happening inside your thoughts. It is happening now. It is happening in this exact moment. It is happening before interpretation, before mental narrative. And perhaps this is one of the deepest discoveries a human being can make, that there is a way of living where you are not constantly trapped inside the mind. But here is something even more interesting. When people begin touching these moments of presence, they often believe they must learn to stay there permanently. They think presence means eliminating thoughts, or living in constant silence. But this creates another form of effort, another form of searching, another subtle tension, and that tension can actually push presence away. Because presence cannot be forced. It does not appear when you try to control it. It appears when something inside you begins to relax the impulse to think all the time. And when that relaxation begins, something very interesting emerges. You realize that presence is not extraordinary. It is not mystical. It is not distant. In fact, being present may be the simplest thing there is. So simple that the mind constantly overlooks it. Because the mind is always searching for something more complex, something deeper, something extraordinary. But presence is quiet, it is simple, it is natural, and the more this presence begins appearing in your experience, the more something curious begins happening. You start noticing that many of the things that once seemed urgent are not truly urgent. Many worries that once dominated your mind were simply repeated stories. Many internal conflicts that once felt so important begin losing their grip, not because everything was solved, but because you stopped being completely absorbed inside those mental narratives. And this is only the beginning of something much deeper. Because when presence begins appearing more often in your life, something even more profound begins unfolding. Something that changes how you see yourself. Something that changes how you experience reality. But before we explore that, there is an important question we need to look at. If presence is so natural, why is it so easy to lose it? And what actually begins happening inside us when we start living more and more in this state of awareness? That is exactly what we are going to explore next. There is something very curious about presence that most people do not notice at the beginning of the awakening journey. Most people believe presence is something that needs to be created. They imagine they must train the mind. They believe they must apply effort. They assume there must be a technique that allows them to finally remain in the present moment. But when you observe more carefully, something interesting begins to appear. Presence is not something you create. Presence is something that was already here before you even started thinking. In fact, if you look closely right now, you may notice something happening in this very moment. Before any thought appears, there is a space of awareness, a silent space, a space where everything is being perceived. The sounds around you, the sensations in your body, the environment, your breathing, even your thoughts. This space has always been present, but for most of life, people do not notice it, because the mind is constantly busy, thinking, analyzing, comparing, interpreting, creating stories about everything that happens. And when the mind is constantly doing this, something very interesting occurs. It begins to appear as the center of experience. People begin believing they are the mind. They believe they are their thoughts. They believe they are the stories constantly appearing in their heads. But when moments of presence begin appearing, that identification slowly starts weakening. Perhaps you have already noticed something like this. A thought appears, and for a moment, you simply observe it, without reacting immediately, without automatically following it, without getting lost inside it. And in that small moment, something interesting happens. You begin noticing a difference between the thought and the one who notices the thought. And that difference changes everything. Because for years, sometimes decades, most people live believing they are exactly the same thing. Thought appears gives reaction. Thought appears gives emotion. Thought appears gives story. Thought appears gives worry. Thought appears gives identity. But when presence begins appearing more frequently, that automatic chain starts slowing down. Suddenly, a space appears, a small gap, a moment where the thought arises. But you do not have to follow it. And inside that gap something powerful begins to emerge. Freedom. Not external freedom, but a much deeper freedom. The freedom of not being completely dominated by the movement of the mind. This does not mean thoughts disappear. They still appear, but the relationship with them begins changing. Before, every thought felt extremely important. Now, many of them simply appear as thoughts, temporary narratives moving through the mind. And the more clearly you see this, the more something interesting begins happening. The mind slowly loses its automatic authority. And here something curious appears. Many people, when they begin noticing this space of presence, think something is wrong. They say things like, "My mind feels quieter. It feels like I'm less caught in thought. It's strange. It feels like I'm just observing, but nothing is wrong." Something very natural is beginning to happen. You are beginning to notice something that has always been here. The awareness that perceives everything. And when this awareness becomes clearer, the way you live starts changing. Not dramatically at first, but very subtly. You react less automatically. You start noticing patterns in the mind that previously went unnoticed. You start seeing how many thoughts appear, without you actually choosing them. And perhaps one of the most curious realizations begins appearing. If thoughts appear by themselves, who exactly is thinking? This question may seem strange at first, but when you observe the mind carefully, something fascinating begins happening. You see that thoughts appear. They simply arise, just like sounds arise, just like sensations arise, just like emotions arise. And when this becomes clear, something inside you begins to relax, because if you do not have to follow every thought, perhaps you also do not have to believe every thought. And when that begins happening, something deeply transformative appears. An inner space, a space where you can simply be here, without constantly constructing a story about who you are, without interpreting every moment of life, without trying to control every experience. But here is something very important that many people discover at this stage of the journey. At first, these moments of presence still appear and disappear. Sometimes you are completely present, and a few minutes later, you are once again lost in thought. And this can create a common question. Why is it so easy to lose presence? But perhaps this question is not entirely accurate, because maybe presence never actually disappeared. Maybe what disappears is simply our conscious attention to it. And when we begin observing this more deeply, a new understanding begins emerging. Presence was never something we had to create. It was always here. What changes is simply whether we are aware of it or not. And this realization opens the door to something even deeper. Because when presence becomes more stable, something surprising begins happening with the very experience of reality. But to understand that, we first need to explore something essential. If presence is always here, why does the mind constantly try to escape it? This is one of the most important questions of the awakening journey. And that is exactly what we will explore next. There is a very interesting moment that begins to appear when presence becomes slightly more frequent in your experience. At first, these moments seem like small gaps of silence, just a few seconds where the mind is not completely busy. But after some time, something curious begins to happen. You start realizing that presence is not simply a state of silence. It begins to change how you experience everything. Perhaps you have already felt something like this. A moment where you are simply walking somewhere, or sitting quietly, or just observing your surroundings, and suddenly you begin noticing things that previously went completely unnoticed. The movement of wind through the trees, the distant sound of something happening far away, the sensation of your own body breathing. These things were always there. But when the mind is constantly busy, they fade into the background, almost invisible. The mind creates a kind of filter, a filter that selects only what seems relevant to its thinking, problems, planning, memories, worries, stories about the past, projections about the future. And when that filter is constantly active, much of the direct experience of life disappears from perception. But when presence begins to appear, that filter slowly weakens. And something very interesting happens. Life begins to feel more direct, simpler, more alive, not because something extraordinary happened, but because you are finally perceiving what has always been happening, life as it actually is. Without constant interpretation, without endless stories, without mental projections. And perhaps this is one of the most surprising aspects of presence. It does not add anything to experience. It simply removes the excess, the noise, the constant mental commentary about everything. And when that commentary becomes quieter, something interesting appears. A kind of peace that does not depend on external circumstances. A peace very different from the one the mind usually searches for. Because when the mind searches for peace, it usually tries to solve something first. It thinks, when I solve this problem, I will be peaceful. When things improve, I will relax. When life becomes easier, then I can feel calm. But that peace always seems to live somewhere in the future. Presence reveals something completely different. It shows that there is a form of peace that does not depend on solving everything in life, because that peace does not come from controlling reality. It comes from not constantly fighting the present moment, and this is something many people slowly begin noticing. When you are present, even if circumstances are not perfect, there is less resistance, less internal tension, less conflict between what is happening and what the mind believes should be happening. And this changes the entire experience of living, because much of human suffering does not come directly from life circumstances. It comes from the constant mental resistance to those circumstances. The mind is always saying, this should not be happening, this needs to change, this is wrong, and that resistance creates constant tension. But when presence appears, something curious happens. That resistance begins to weaken. Not because you gave up on life, not because you stopped acting, but because you are no longer completely trapped inside the mental narrative that tries to control everything. You begin to see that many things are simply happening. And when you observe this carefully, a new relationship with life begins emerging. A relationship less based on control, and more based on awareness. This does not mean passivity. It does not mean accepting everything without action. It simply means your actions begin arising from a different place. A place less dominated by fear, less dominated by reactivity, less dominated by mental narratives. But here something interesting appears. When people begin experiencing more presence, they often notice something unexpected, something that may even feel uncomfortable at first. They begin noticing how busy the mind constantly was, how many thoughts were happening all the time, how many narratives were running automatically, and this can create a strange sensation, as if suddenly you are seeing something that was always happening, but previously invisible. It is as if a light was turned on inside the mind, and you begin observing the constant movement of thoughts. At first, this may feel strange, but in reality it is an important sign. It means awareness is beginning to observe the functioning of the mind itself. And when this happens, something profound becomes possible. You begin seeing that thoughts are not necessarily reality. They are simply interpretations, temporary narratives appearing and disappearing. And when this insight begins deepening, something even more interesting happens. Your sense of identity begins to shift. For most of life, people believe they are what they think. But when presence becomes more frequent, that certainty begins dissolving. Because if you can observe your thoughts, then perhaps you are not exactly the one who is thinking them. And this realization opens an enormous door. A door to a completely different way of experiencing life. But before we fully understand that shift, there is something very important we need to explore. Because when presence deepens, it does not only change how you perceive the world, It begins to change who you believe yourself to be. And that is where the journey becomes even more interesting. Because the question is no longer just, how do I live in presence? It becomes something much deeper. Who is the one that is present? And this question can transform the way you understand yourself. And that is exactly what we will explore next. When presence begins to appear more frequently in your experience, something very interesting starts happening inside the mind. At first, the change may seem subtle, almost invisible. You still have thoughts, you still feel emotions, you still react to many situations in life. Externally, it may seem as if nothing has changed, but internally, something begins to reorganize. And this reorganization happens at a very deep level of awareness. Perhaps you have already noticed something like this. A situation happens. Before, the mind would immediately react. It would create a story, interpret the situation, build a judgment. Maybe irritation would arise, maybe worry, maybe anxiety. But when presence begins appearing, something new arises between the stimulus and the reaction. A small space, a silent moment, a moment where you notice what is happening before reacting automatically. And this small space changes everything. Because for most of life, human experience functions in a very automatic way. Something happens, the mind interprets, an emotion arises, a reaction follows. All of this happens in a fraction of a second. So quickly that most people believe this automatic reaction is who they are. But when presence begins appearing, this chain begins slowing down. You begin noticing the reaction appearing. You notice the thought arising. You notice the emotion forming. And in that moment something very important happens. You are no longer completely merged with it. You are aware of it. And this difference is extremely powerful, because when you notice something you are no longer completely inside it. This creates a new relationship with the mind itself. Before, every thought felt like absolute truth. Now, many thoughts appear simply as movements of the mind. Before, every emotion demanded immediate resolution. Now, many emotions appear as temporary experiences. Before, every situation required immediate reaction. Now, you see that sometimes there is space to simply observe. This does not mean becoming emotionally numb. It does not mean you stop feeling. In fact, many people report the opposite. When presence deepens, emotional experience often becomes clearer, more direct, more authentic, but without the avalanche of mental narratives that normally amplify suffering. For example, before a simple situation could trigger a long chain of thoughts, something happens, the mind interprets, then creates another story, then another, then begins imagining the future, then revisits the past, and within minutes the mind has created an entire world of worries. But when presence appears, this process begins weakening. You notice the thought arising, but it does not necessarily generate 10 more thoughts. You notice the emotion appearing, but it does not necessarily become a dramatic narrative. And gradually something becomes clear. Much of human suffering does not come directly from life experiences. It comes from the constant interpretation the mind builds around those experiences. And when presence dissolves some of that interpretation, life begins to feel much simpler. Situations still happen, challenges still exist, but the mental weight attached to those situations begins to dissolve. This does not mean all problems disappear, but it means your relationship with them changes profoundly, because now there is space. Space to observe, space to breathe, space to respond consciously. And perhaps this is one of the most important transformations presence brings. It does not only change what you perceive, it changes how you respond to what you perceive. But here something very interesting begins to appear. When presence grows, you begin noticing how the mind was constantly trying to control reality, control what happens, control what people do, control the future, control even your own thoughts. But presence reveals something different. It shows that much of this control is simply the mind seeking security. The mind wants certainty. It wants prediction. It wants to avoid pain, but life rarely works that way. Life is movement, change, uncertainty. And when presence deepens, you begin noticing something curious. Perhaps it is not necessary to control every detail of reality. Perhaps life can be lived with more openness, more flexibility, more awareness. And when that begins happening, something profound starts changing. The constant mental tension begins dissolving, and with that tension dissolving, something new begins emerging, a different kind of intelligence, an intelligence not based purely on analytical thinking, but on deeper perception. Many people call this intuition, but before we explore that, there is something very important we must understand first. Because when presence begins changing how you respond to life, it also begins revealing something even deeper, something about identity, something about who you believe yourself to be. And when that discovery begins appearing, the awakening journey enters a completely new stage, a stage where the question is no longer simply, how do I live in presence, but something far deeper, if I can observe my mind, who am I? And this question can completely transform the way you understand yourself, and that is exactly what we will explore next. As presence begins to deepen in your experience, something very interesting begins to happen with the way you perceive yourself. For most of life, a person's identity is built almost entirely through the mind. Thoughts define who you believe you are, stories about the past shape your sense of identity, expectations about the future create the feeling of direction, and slowly, without noticing, a person begins living inside a constant mental narrative, a narrative that says, this is who I am, this is how my life is, this is my story. But when moments of presence begin appearing more frequently, something very curious starts happening. That mental narrative begins losing some of its solidity. Perhaps you have already noticed something like this. A thought appears. Before, it felt like a definitive statement about who you were. Now it simply appears as a thought, a sentence arising in the mind, something temporary. This change may seem small at first, but it begins transforming how you perceive yourself. Because for most of life, people believe they are exactly what they think about themselves. If the mind says, I'm not good enough, they believe it. If the mind says, I've always been this way, they accept it. If the mind says, this is impossible, they stop before even trying. But when presence begins expanding, something becomes clear. Thoughts are not necessarily truth. They are interpretations, temporary narratives, movements of the mind attempting to organize reality. And when this realization begins deepening, something incredibly liberating starts emerging. You begin noticing that your identity may not be as fixed as it once seemed. Perhaps many ideas you had about yourself were simply repeated narratives reinforced by past experiences, by opinions of others, by memories the mind organized in a certain way. But when presence appears, these narratives begin being seen more clearly. You realize that there is something within you observing all those stories, something that was present before any thought appeared, something that remains present even when thoughts change. And when this insight begins maturing, something profound happens. Identity becomes more flexible, more open, less rigid. Before, the mind constantly tried defining who you were. Now something inside you begins realizing that definition was never complete. Perhaps you are something far larger than any thought could describe. And this realization transforms the way you live. Because when you believe you are only the narrative of the mind, every thought feels extremely important. Every criticism feels threatening. Every mistake feels like confirmation of something negative about you. But when presence begins dissolving that identification, these experiences begin appearing differently. Mistakes still happen, challenges still appear, but they no longer define who you are. They simply become experiences within life. And this shift creates something very interesting. A growing sense of inner space, a space where thoughts may arise, but they no longer control your identity. A space where emotions may appear, but they do not define who you believe yourself to be. Inside this space something important begins emerging, a different kind of trust. Not trust based on control, not trust based on certainty, but a quiet trust in awareness itself, a trust in the fact that you can observe the experience of life without being completely dominated by it. And when this trust begins growing, something very interesting happens. The mind begins losing its constant need to defend a fixed identity. For most of life, the mind tries protecting an image of who you are. It tries proving itself right. It tries avoiding vulnerability. It tries controlling how others perceive you. But when presence deepens, this constant defense begins relaxing, because you begin realizing something very simple. The mental identity was never as solid as it appeared. It was always a construction, a narrative, a collection of thoughts organized in a certain way. And when this becomes clear, something inside you begins opening. A sense of freedom begins emerging. The freedom of not needing to constantly maintain a story about who you are. The freedom to simply experience life moment by moment. But here something important begins appearing. When identification with the mind starts dissolving, something new begins emerging, something many people begin perceiving clearly. A growing sense of inner guidance, as if a deeper intelligence were quietly guiding your perception. An intelligence not limited to analytical thinking. An intelligence that appears when the mind becomes quieter. And this is where something very interesting begins happening in the awakening journey. Because when presence opens this inner space, something begins naturally emerging. Something many spiritual traditions call inner guidance. But what exactly is this guidance? How does it appear, and how can you trust it without falling into the illusions of the mind? That is exactly what we will explore next. As presence begins to become more natural in your experience, something very quiet begins to change within you. It is not a dramatic shift. It does not happen all at once. It is gradual, almost as if a new way of perceiving life is slowly emerging inside awareness. At first, the change may seem very small. Just a few moments of silence between thoughts. A few moments where you notice your breath. Moments where you observe what is happening without immediately reacting. But as these moments begin appearing more often, something interesting begins to happen. You start realizing that living in presence does not mean escaping life. It actually means entering life more completely than ever before. Because for most of life, people are not truly living the present moment. They are living inside thoughts about the present moment. Thoughts about what should happen. Thoughts about what already happened. Thoughts about what might happen. And while the mind is constantly occupied with those narratives, the direct experience of life quietly passes by. But when presence begins growing, something profound begins to shift. You begin noticing that every moment contains far more than the mind usually perceives. There is a richness of experience constantly unfolding, sensations, movements, silence, subtle details of reality that previously went unnoticed. And when awareness begins resting more frequently in this space of presence, something very interesting begins to emerge. A growing sense of inner alignment, as if your actions begin arising from a clearer place. Less reactive, less impulsive, less driven by fear. This does not mean life becomes perfect. Challenges still appear. Difficult situations still happen. Emotions still arise. But something inside you begins relating to those experiences differently. There is more space, more clarity, more awareness before reaction. And when this inner space begins expanding, something very curious begins emerging. Many people begin noticing a form of inner guidance, a quiet sense of knowing. Not intellectual knowing, not analytical thinking, but a deeper perception, almost as if awareness itself begins gently guiding your actions. This guidance does not shout, it does not force, it does not appear as a dramatic voice. Often it appears in very simple ways, a feeling of clarity, a sense of alignment, a quiet knowing that something feels naturally right. At first it can be difficult to trust this, because for most of life we were taught to trust only thought, to trust analysis, to trust logic. But when something quieter begins appearing inside awareness, the mind may question it, try to control it, try to interpret it. Yet over time, something interesting begins happening. You begin noticing that this quiet guidance is often clearer than the thoughts themselves. It appears when the mind is quiet. It appears when you are present. It appears when you are not trying to control everything. And slowly a new form of trust begins emerging. Trust in awareness itself. But this trust grows gradually, through experience. Through observing how life begins flowing differently when you are truly present. And this leads to something even more interesting, because when this inner guidance becomes clearer, it begins becoming a natural part of your experience. Many people start realizing there is a quiet intelligence operating within consciousness itself, an intelligence that does not need thought in order to know, an intelligence that perceives even before thought appears. And this is where the awakening journey begins, revealing something even deeper. Because when you begin trusting this inner guidance, the way you live starts changing. Decisions arise differently. Actions begin emerging with more clarity. Life situations sometimes begin aligning in unexpected ways. But what exactly is this inner guidance? How does it work? And how can you learn to recognize when it is truly present? That is exactly what we will explore in the next video, when inner guidance finally becomes clear. Gratitude for being here. Much light on your path. Quantum silence.